Late one stormy night, an old man named Arthur discovered a forgotten trunk in the dusty attic of his crumbling estate. Its rusted lock bore the initials J.W., those of his childhood friend who had vanished mysteriously decades ago. Against his better judgment, Arthur pried it open, revealing a collection of eerie belongings, photographs, letters, and a strange, charred diary. As he reached for the diary, an unholy scream erupted, shaking the house and filling it with a chilling, otherworldly presence. Arthur had always been a man of quiet routines. Since retiring, his days revolved around tending his garden, reading novels by the glow of his favorite lamp, and sitting by the crackling fireplace. Life was steady, predictable, until tonight. The storm outside was restless, its howling winds and pounding rain stirring something within Arthur that he couldn't name. The attic, a place he had avoided for years, seemed to call to him. Lantern in hand, he climbed the creaking staircase, each step heavy with hesitation. The air grew colder as he entered, the scent of age and mildew filling his nostrils. The attic was a chaotic graveyard of forgotten belongings, furniture cloaked in dust, faded newspapers, and boxes stacked haphazardly. Arthur's lantern revealed a peculiar sight in the corner: a trunk. Unlike the other objects around it, this trunk seemed untouched by time. Its cracked leather surface and tarnished brass fittings exuded a strange aura, as though it had been waiting. On its lid were engraved initials: J.W. His breath caught. J.W. James Worthing. The name was a ghost from Arthur's past. James had been his childhood friend, practically a brother until one summer night 50 years ago when he vanished without a trace. The memories of James, his laugh, their secret games, their shared dreams, rushed back like a flood. Arthur couldn't recall ever seeing this trunk before, let alone why it would be in his attic. A cold unease settled over him, but curiosity outweighed his fear. He approached cautiously, the air around the trunk feeling heavy, almost alive. Running his fingers over the initials, Arthur felt a chill as if he were disturbing something best left untouched. The lock on the trunk was old but intact, its surface scratched as though someone had tried and failed to open it. After a moment of hesitation, Arthur decided to move it to the parlor. Dragging it down the narrow stairs was a challenge. Despite its size, the trunk was unnaturally heavy, its weight pressing down on him like a physical manifestation of the past. In the warmth of the parlor's firelight, the trunk seemed less menacing but no less mysterious. Arthur examined it closely, tracing the initials again. James, he whispered, the name feeling foreign after all these years. He fetched a screwdriver and hammer, working carefully to pry the lock open. The process was slow, each creak of metal a tense reminder that he was crossing a line. Finally, with a sharp snap, the lock gave way and the lid creaked open. Arthur leaned back, his pulse racing. The first thing he saw was a black-and-white photograph of himself and James, two young boys standing arm in arm in front of this very house. The photograph was pristine, untouched by time. Beneath it lay a cracked pocket watch, still faintly ticking, and a bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. Arthur unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was elegant yet frantic, the words hurried and disjointed. The letters spoke cryptically of forbidden rituals, warnings, and something called the Gate. Each letter seemed more desperate than the last, as though the writer had been racing against time. Then Arthur found the diary. Bound in black leather and singed at the edges, it radiated an unsettling energy. He hesitated, but his curiosity overruled his caution. Opening the diary, he found entries that began normally but grew increasingly erratic. James wrote of whispers in the dark, shadows that moved on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The final entry made Arthur's stomach churn. The whispers are louder. The gate is opening. I don't have much time. Forgive me, Arthur. A sudden noise broke the silence, a low, guttural moan that seemed to resonate from the very walls of the house. Arthur froze, his heart pounding. The air in the room had grown colder, heavier. The fire flickered, its light faltering against the encroaching darkness. Arthur's gaze snapped back to the trunk. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though it were exhaling. Then, faint but distinct, a whisper echoed through the room. It was a sound unlike any he had ever heard, neither human nor animal, but something in between. Arthur stepped back, clutching the diary to his chest. He wanted to close the trunk, to lock it away and forget it ever existed. But it was too late. Whatever he had disturbed, it was awake now. The room itself seemed to pulse, a heartbeat that did not belong to him. Arthur stared at the trunk, its open lid revealing nothing else of note, and yet he felt it was watching him. The whispering grew louder, though no clear words formed. It was as if multiple voices were speaking over one another in a language foreign to human ears. Arthur's knees threatened to buckle as the weight of an unseen presence pressed down on him. The lantern's light dimmed further, shadows growing darker, longer, and more aggressive. Arthur forced himself to move, slamming the trunk shut with trembling hands. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving silence in their wake. He stood there, breathless, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a single sound emerged, a slow, deliberate knock. Arthur turned toward the source, dread pooling in his stomach. Whatever had been released was no longer confined to the trunk. Arthur's trembling hand hovered near the diary as the knock echoed again, louder this time. The sound reverberated through the old house, sending shivers down his spine. It was not the casual rapping of a visitor. It was deliberate, heavy, and filled with intent. Swallowing his fear, he stepped toward the parlor door. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the shadows danced on the walls as if alive. "Who's there?" Arthur's voice cracked, barely audible over the crackling fire. No answer came, only silence so dense it pressed against his ears. For a moment he thought it might be the storm, a loose shutter, or a branch against the window. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted in the house, something unnatural. The knock came again, this time from the opposite end of the house. Arthur whipped around, his lantern shaking in his hand. Slowly, he moved toward the source, each step hesitant. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, their echoes swallowed by the oppressive stillness. As he approached the far door, the air grew colder, biting against his skin. His trembling hand reached for the doorknob, but before he could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. Arthur froze, his breath catching in his throat. Beyond the door lay the dining room, dimly lit by the storm's fleeting lightning. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like rusted iron. Arthur stepped inside, his lantern casting feeble light across the room. The furniture was as it always had been, but the atmosphere was charged with a malevolent presence. The knock came again, this time from above. Arthur's eyes darted toward the ceiling. The attic. He could feel the weight of the sound pressing down on him, vibrating through the very bones of the house. His pulse quickened as he realized whatever had been released was moving, exploring its newfound freedom. "James?" he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop himself. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the house were holding its breath. Then a soft, raspy whisper reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. "Arthur." The voice was distant, warped, and filled with an unearthly echo. It was not James, not the James he had known. Panic surged through Arthur as he stumbled back, the lantern shaking violently in his hand. He had to do something. But what? His eyes fell on the diary clutched tightly to his chest. Perhaps it held answers, a way to undo what he had unleashed. Arthur made his way back to the parlor, his steps quick and unsteady. The knock followed him, growing louder and more insistent with each step. He slammed the door shut behind him and bolted it. though he knew it was a futile gesture against whatever force he faced. He placed the diary on the table, its scorched cover seeming to pulsate under the lantern's light. Flipping through the pages, Arthur searched for anything that could help. The handwriting was frantic, the words chaotic and barely legible. James had written of rituals, sacrifices, and something he called the gatekeeper. The descriptions were cryptic, filled with symbols and fragmented sentences, but one thing was clear. James had been desperate to seal whatever he had summoned. The gatekeeper serves as both warden and sentinel, one passage read. Its presence binds the gate, but only if it is appeased. Failure to do so will result in catastrophic consequences. Arthur's heart sank as he read the next lines. The sacrifice must be personal, a bond forged in blood, broken by choice. Only then will the gate remain closed. He slammed the diary shut, his mind racing. A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? The thought filled him with dread, but before he could process it, the knock returned, louder and more aggressive than before. This time, it came from the parlor door. Arthur stared at the door, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The knocking grew more frantic, reverberating through the room like thunder. Then, without warning, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for a match, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The moment the match flared to life, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the parlor door. Its form was indistinct, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to absorb the feeble light. Two hollow eyes stared back at him, voids of nothingness that pierced his soul. Arthur dropped the match in terror, the flame sputtering out as it hit the floor. The room was plunged back into darkness, but the presence remained. He could feel it watching him, its gaze heavy and suffocating. The whispers returned, surrounding him, growing louder and more chaotic. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, their tones ranging from mournful to enraged. Desperation clawed at Arthur as he realized he was out of options. The diary. It was the only link he had to James and whatever nightmare had been unleashed. He grabbed it from the table and flipped through its pages once more, searching for anything he might have missed. One passage caught his eye, written in a different hand than the rest. The letters were sharp, precise, and radiated a sense of finality. The seal is broken. What was hidden cannot be returned without equal cost. The gatekeeper will claim what it is owed. Arthur's blood ran cold as the meaning sank in. The knock came again, this time from inside the room. Slowly he turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. The shadowy figure was no longer at the door. It was here, with him. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that threatened to drive him mad. The last thing Arthur saw before the darkness consumed him was the diary, its pages flipping on their own, revealing symbols that glowed with an unholy light. The storm raged on, and the house fell silent. Arthur was gone, leaving only the diary and trunk, their secrets waiting for the next unwitting soul. The storm raged outside, but the house was unnervingly silent. The quiet pressed down like a suffocating weight, broken only by the faint crackling of embers in the fireplace. Arthur was gone. The diary lay motionless on the table, its scorched cover dull and lifeless, while the trunk loomed in the shadows, as though waiting for something, or someone. Hours passed before the oppressive stillness broke. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and then came a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, it blended into the storm's chaos, but it grew louder, sharper, and insistent. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the attic. The house groaned under the storm's weight. Upstairs, the attic door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness and faint whispers. Shadows crawled along the walls, twisting unnaturally as if alive, climbing toward the attic, drawn by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, their dissonant tones filling the air with a strange, ominous energy. The diary on the table began to tremble. Its pages fluttered as though caught in an invisible wind, flipping rapidly before settling on a single entry. The words glowed faintly, their sharp edges burning into the air. The script was foreign, deliberate, and precise. Blood calls to blood. The seal weakens. The gate awaits. The words vanished, leaving behind a charged silence. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud, but it resonated through the walls, ancient and commanding. "Who will answer the call?" it asked, its tone neither kind nor cruel but filled with authority. The trunk groaned. Its leather surface rippled as though alive, and the brass fittings clinked softly. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic chant. The lid shifted slightly, as though something inside stirred. Upstairs, a burst of cold, unnatural light spilled down the staircase, flooding the house with an eerie glow. The light carried the stench of sulfur and decay. From its center emerged a figure, not solid, not shadow, but a grotesque blend of both. It glided with deliberate purpose, its movements unnaturally smooth. The figure paused in the parlor, its hollow, faceless gaze fixed on the diary. The book snapped shut with a deafening clap, and the trunk's lid flung open violently. A gust of icy wind extinguished the remaining light. The figure extended an appendage, not quite a hand, not quite a shadow, toward the trunk, and from within came a scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was raw and primal, filled with centuries of anguish and rage. The house shook, the walls groaning under the weight of what had been unleashed. The parlor began to twist and warp, its familiar walls shifting as though alive. The figure moved closer to the trunk, and the scream grew louder. Black tendrils emerged, writhing and dripping with tar-like substance that hissed as it hit the floor. From the trunk, something else began to take shape. At first, it was indistinct, but soon it became more defined. A face, grotesque, hollow-eyed, burned with malevolence. The attic figure bent slightly as though acknowledging its superior. The two entities spoke in unison, their discordant voices blending into chilling harmony. "The seal is broken. The gate will open." The shadows in the room swirled violently. The diary, still glowing faintly, trembled as its pages flipped wildly before stopping on another entry. The glowing words formed a chilling message. "The sacrifice has been chosen." From beyond the parlor came a new sound, slow, deliberate footsteps. They grew louder with each passing second. The whispers hushed as the source approached. A figure stepped into the light. It was Arthur. But it wasn't. His eyes were empty voids, his expression blank. He moved mechanically, each step bringing him closer to the trunk. The entities watched silently, their forms rippling with anticipation. Arthur stopped in front of the trunk, his hand extending toward the writhing tendrils within. The diary glowed brighter than ever, illuminating the room with an unnatural brilliance. The words on its open page shifted, rearranging themselves into a single, final sentence. "The bond is broken. The gate will open." Arthur's hand touched the trunk. The room exploded with light and sound. The scream returned, louder than ever, shaking the house to its foundation. Shadows surged forward, consuming Arthur, the trunk, and the entities in one blinding instant. And then it was over. The house stood silent once more. The storm outside reduced to faint thunder. The diary lay closed on the table, its glow extinguished. The trunk sat motionless in the corner, its surface dull and lifeless. The air in the house was different, heavier, charged with a presence that hadn't been there before. The gate had opened and something had crossed through, and it was still here. The house settled into a restless quiet, broken only by faint echoes of the storm fading into the distance. The diary remained closed on the parlor table, but its presence was unnerving, humming faintly, as though alive. The trunk, now still and unremarkable, radiated a weight, its secrets far from contained. Across town, Ethan, Arthur's estranged nephew, tossed in his sleep. His dreams were vivid, filled with the scent of mildew and the cold touch of damp air. He stood before Arthur's house, its silhouette menacing under a storm-darkened sky. Something called to him from within. A whisper, faint but insistent. Ethan woke with a start, sweat dripping from his brow. The clock read 3:14 a.m. His heart thudded, but he couldn't shake the image of the house. Arthur had always been an enigma, a reclusive figure, distant and mysterious. They hadn't spoken in years, but the dream left Ethan with an undeniable urge to act. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sky pale and gray. Ethan decided to visit the house. Packing a flashlight and a notebook, he set out on the hour-long drive. The thought felt absurd, but something gnawed at him, a pull he couldn't explain. The house came into view, its weathered structure unchanged yet darker, heavier, as if the storm's shadow lingered. Ethan parked at the edge of the overgrown driveway and hesitated. The air was dense, electric, prickling his skin. The front door was ajar, creaking open with a soft push. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint tang of rust. "Arthur," Ethan called, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. The house felt abandoned, its shadows unnaturally long. In the parlor, the diary caught his attention immediately. Its charred cover absorbed the dim light, and the air around it felt heavier. Next to it, the trunk sat innocuously, its surface dull. Ethan's breath hitched. The objects unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. Curiosity overtook caution as Ethan reached for the diary. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the air shifted. A low hum filled the room, faint at first but growing louder. Ethan froze, a chill racing down his spine. He flipped open the diary, its pages fluttering unnaturally to a specific entry. "The sacrifice has been taken. The gate remains open. Blood calls to blood." Ethan staggered back, the words pulsing with a strange light. The hum intensified, accompanied by whispers, faint and fragmented, like voices from within the walls. The trunk groaned softly, its lid shifting slightly. Dread pooled in Ethan's stomach as he stared at it. The whispers grew louder, forming distinct words. "Another must answer. Another must answer." The chant echoed, reverberating in his chest. A gust of wind slammed the front door shut, making Ethan jump. The room's temperature plummeted, his breath visible in the frigid air. Shadows in the corners thickened, growing darker. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight shaking as the trunk shifted again. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The only response was a guttural whisper that came from everywhere. "You were called." Panic surged as the trunk's lid creaked further open, revealing a black void. Shadows slithered toward him. Ethan tripped and fell, his flashlight rolling across the floor, its beam cutting through the darkness. From within the trunk, a faint light emerged, cold and otherworldly. The tendrils of shadow retreated, wary of the glow. Ethan stared as the light grew, revealing something shifting inside. A shape, indistinct but alive. Before he could react, a voice cut through the chaos, sharp, clear, commanding. "Close it! Close the gate!" It wasn't his voice, nor the whispers. It sounded familiar, like Arthur's, but distorted. Ethan scrambled to his feet, the diary catching his eye again. The pages flipped on their own, the words shifting. One line glowed brighter than the rest. "Only the willing may seal the gate." His hands shook as he reached for the trunk's lid. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, pressing against his chest. The glow inside pulsed, each pulse accompanied by a low hum that rattled his bones. "Another must answer," the whispers repeated, their tone pleading. Ethan hesitated, torn between fleeing and the compulsion to act. The diary's words burned in his mind. Only the willing. Summoning courage, Ethan reached for the trunk, his hand trembling as it hovered over the lid. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and the light inside flared violently. Just as his fingers touched the edge, the room was engulfed in blinding light. When the light faded, the parlor was silent. The trunk sat closed, its surface unchanged. The diary lay open on the table, its pages blank. Ethan stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened, or what he had done. Outside, storm clouds began to gather once more. This time, however, there was no lightning, just a dense, looming darkness creeping closer to the horizon. Ethan felt it before he saw it, the house itself seeming to breathe, its walls alive with the echoes of something vast and waiting. The storm clouds thickened, wrapping the house in a suffocating shroud of darkness. Ethan stood frozen in the parlor, his breath shallow as the walls seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. The diary remained open on the table, its blank pages unmoving, and the trunk sat eerily silent. Yet, the air was alive with tension, as if the house itself was waiting for his next move. Ethan's knees buckled and he fell into a chair. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The voice, Arthur's voice, had been clear. Close it. Close the gate. But the trunk was closed now, and yet the room felt heavier, colder, as if whatever was inside wasn't truly contained. His trembling hand reached for the diary. Nothing happened. The pages were blank, the glow gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed louder than the storm outside. His gaze drifted toward the trunk, its dull, weathered surface betraying none of the horror he knew it held. The storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room and casting distorted shadows on the walls. Ethan thought he saw something move, a flicker in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. A sudden knock shattered the silence. Ethan spun toward the front door, his heart leaping. The knock came again, deliberate, followed by a voice. "Ethan, it's Sam. Open the door." Sam, Ethan's childhood friend. Why was he here now of all times? Relief turned to suspicion. "Sam," Ethan called, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "Let me in. We need to talk." Ethan hesitated. Something about the timing felt wrong, but the alternative, facing the house alone, felt worse. He unlocked the door and opened it. Sam stood on the porch, drenched from the rain. His eyes darted past Ethan and into the house. "You shouldn't be here," he said, stepping inside. "This place, it's not safe." "No kidding," Ethan muttered. "Why are you here?" "I had a dream," Sam said flatly. "About this house, about Arthur, and about you. I don't know how, but I knew you'd be here." Sam's gaze shifted to the diary in the trunk. His expression darkened. "You touched them, didn't you?" "I didn't have a choice," Ethan said. "The diary, it opened on its own. And the trunk." He trailed off, unable to explain. Sam exhaled sharply. "The trunk isn't just a cursed relic. It's a gate, Ethan. A gate to something we can't comprehend." Ethan's anger bubbled up. "Then why didn't Arthur warn me? Why leave it behind?" Sam hesitated. "He didn't leave it for you. He left it for himself, to contain whatever's inside." Ethan reeled. "Arthur's gone. If it's so dangerous, why abandon it?" Sam glanced at the diary. "I don't think he left. Not entirely. He's somewhere, and I think he's trying to reach out." The temperature dropped sharply. Both men turned as a faint noise emanated from the trunk, a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. Ethan backed away. "It's happening again. I thought I closed it." "You didn't," Sam said grimly. "You delayed it. The gate is still open." The pulsing intensified, and the diary's pages began to flip wildly. Words scrawled themselves across the paper. "Two must answer. Two must seal." Sam read the words aloud, pale. "It needs 2 of us." Ethan's chest tightened. "Seal it? How?" "I don't know," Sam admitted, "but we don't have time to figure it out." He grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward the trunk. "We have to do it now." The room darkened, shadows creeping in. The trunk's lid shifted, the pulsing turning to a deafening roar. The air grew thick, suffocating. The shadows moved unnaturally, slithering along the walls and floor, encircling the 2 men. Ethan's hand hovered over the trunk. "What if we're wrong?" "Then we deal with it," Sam said firmly. "If we do nothing, there won't be anything left to save." They locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Together, they reached for the trunk's lid. The moment their hands touched it, the roar ceased, replaced by silence. The diary burst into flames, its pages curling into ash as a blinding light erupted from the trunk. The house shook violently, the floor splitting beneath their feet. Ethan and Sam held on, gripping the trunk as the light engulfed them. Time seemed to stretch as the light grew brighter, searing their vision. They felt a force pulling at them, not physically, but something deeper, like it was reaching into their very essence. Ethan's mind flooded with fragmented images. Arthur standing before the trunk, shadows twisting around him. The diary's glowing words etched into walls. A void that seemed endless. And then everything went still. The room was eerily calm. The trunk was closed, its surface cool to the touch. The diary was gone, reduced to ash. Ethan and Sam stood in silence, their breaths ragged. "It's over," Ethan said, though he didn't believe it. Sam looked to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the sky unnaturally clear. "For now," he said. But in the corner of the room, the shadows shifted. The house stood eerily silent after the light faded. The storm clouds had lifted, but the air inside was dense and heavy, as if something unseen had taken root. Ethan and Sam stood in the parlor, frozen. The trunk, now sealed and motionless, seemed inert, yet the shifting shadows in the corners hinted otherwise. Sam broke the silence. "We need to leave. Now." Ethan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the trunk. "If it's over, why doesn't it feel like it?" Sam hesitated. "Because it's not over. We may have sealed the trunk, but whatever's inside, it's still here." Ethan turned to the diary's ashes, sifting through them with trembling fingers. "We're missing something," he muttered. "Arthur's voice, the diary, the words. It all led to this, but it doesn't feel finished." Sam walked to the trunk and placed a hand on its surface. "It's cold," he murmured, his brow furrowed, "but I can feel it pushing against the seal." Ethan joined him, kneeling beside the trunk. The hum they'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet. What if it's waiting for something, or someone? Sam's expression darkened. "You mean us?" Before Ethan could answer, the shadows in the corners began to shift. They grew, spreading like ink along the walls. The room's temperature plummeted, and an all-too-familiar hum began to vibrate through the air. "Ethan," Sam said sharply, standing. "We need to go. Now." But Ethan didn't move. The hum intensified, and the trunk's surface began to ripple. Fragments of the diary's words echoed in his mind. 2 must answer. 2 must seal. The realization hit him like a punch. "We didn't finish it," he whispered. "We just stopped it temporarily. We're the key, Sam. We have to lock it permanently." Sam paled. "You're saying we have to go in there?" The hum became a deafening roar. Shadows crept closer, the room growing darker. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "If we don't, it'll break free." Sam hesitated, fear etched into his features, but then he nodded, his jaw set. "Okay," he said, "let's finish this." Together, they placed their hands on the trunk's lid. The moment their fingers touched it, the room exploded with light. Shadows recoiled as the lid flew open. A cold, otherworldly wind poured out, pulling at them with magnetic force. The void inside the trunk was no longer empty. It pulsated with dark energy, stretching endlessly. Ethan and Sam were dragged into it, their screams swallowed by the roar. When they landed, the world around them was pitch black, the only light the faint glow of the trunk's opening far above. Shapes emerged from the darkness, shifting and writhing. Glowing eyes locked onto them as a voice boomed, "Two must seal. The bond must be complete." Ethan's heart pounded. What does it mean? What are we supposed to do? The shadows surrounded them, and the voice softened. The willing must complete the seal. The willing must stay. Ethan turned to Sam, panic in his eyes. Stay? It means, one of us. Sam met his gaze, understanding flashing in his eyes. No, Ethan said firmly. There has to be another way. There isn't, Sam replied. The shadows closed in, the void trembling as the voice repeated. The willing must stay. Sam placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a sad smile crossing his face. You have to go back. Someone has to keep it sealed. Before Ethan could protest, Sam pushed him toward the trunk's opening. The force was overwhelming, and Ethan felt himself being pulled upward, his screams fading into the light. When Ethan awoke, he was back in the parlor. The trunk was closed, its surface cool and still. The house was silent, the shadows gone. But Sam was nowhere to be seen. Ethan sank to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He knew in his heart that Sam had stayed behind to seal the gate. The house was safe, for now, but the cost had been immeasurable. As Ethan stood, a strange calm settled over him. The storm had passed, the sky bright and clear, but deep within the trunk a faint hum stirred, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Outside the house the air seemed lighter, yet the weight of what had been done lingered. Ethan locked the front door behind him, his hands trembling. He knew the trunk had to remain sealed, but the nagging thought remained. How long before it opens again? He turned toward the horizon, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Yet something about the light felt wrong, as if it carried a whisper of the darkness they had faced. Ethan shuddered. The price had been paid, but the danger had not vanished. It was only waiting. As he reached his car, Ethan hesitated, looking back at the house one last time. The windows reflected nothing but the sky, but in the back of his mind, he thought he saw a figure standing inside, watching him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, but the unease lingered as he started the engine and drove away. The house remained still, its walls silent and its secrets contained. For now. But deep within, the faint hum grew louder,